In this video, I'm going to show you how to place decimals on a number line. So I've written 5 different decimals here, and because I have a blank number line, my first task is to figure out where my number line will begin and where it will end. Because all 5 of these numbers are greater than 0 and less than 1 whole, I'm going to have my number line start at 0 and end at 1. I am also going to place some benchmark decimals that will be useful in just a minute. The first one I'm going to place is a half. And a half is right about there, and as a decimal, a half is 0 and 5/10. The next one I'm going to place is half of a half, and that would be 1/4, and 1/4 goes right about there, and 1/4 is the same thing as 1/4, and a quarter is worth 25 cents. So 1/4 is 0 and 25 hundredths. And the last benchmark decimal that I'm going to place is 3/4, which goes right about here. And 3/4 or 3/4 is 75 cents, so it is 75 hundredths. And because some of the decimals that I'm trying to place have digits that are in the thousandths place, I'm going to make all of my benchmark decimals go to the thousandths place by making equivalent decimals. I can do that by placing a 0 right there, a 0 in the hundredths and thousandths right here, a 0 in the thousandths right here. So I'm going to start with my first decimal, which is 0 and 263 hundredths, and I'm going to compare it to each of my benchmark decimals. Anytime I'm comparing, I always start with a half, and I ask myself, is it greater than or less than a half? In this case, there's a 5 in the tenths at a half, and there's only a 2 in the tenths in the number I'm comparing it to, so it is less than that. So then I move to 1/4. There's both a 2 in the tenths, so I'll look at the next digit. There's a 5 in the tenths in 1/4 and a 6 in the tenths in 263 hundredths. So 263 hundredths is greater than 1/4. I can move it up to here, and I can now estimate approximately where it belongs on the number line by looking at the size of those digits there. That I have 263 thousandths, this is 250 thousandths, that's only 13 thousandths more than 250, and this all the way over here is 500 thousandths, so I'm not very far from 1/4. So if I were to place that on my number line, I'd put it right about here. It's very, very close to 25 hundredths, 1/4, just slightly greater. My next decimal is 4/10 right here. I'm going to go ahead and also give it 2 more place values so it's easier to compare to everything. So now it's 400 thousandths. That is equivalent to 4/10. There's nothing in the hundredths and nothing in the thousandths. Just like I did before, I'm going to start comparing it to my half right here. And half has 5 in the tenths. This has 4 in the tenths, so it is less than 1/2. Because it also has 4 in the tenths, it's greater than 1/4. And if we're looking at the whole number now, 400 thousandths compared to 500 thousandths, 400 thousandths is closer to 500 thousandths than it is to 250 thousandths. So let me use estimation to try to figure out approximately where that would go. I'm going to say that, it looks like 300 thousandths is approximately right there. So that would make 400 thousandths be right about here. If you look at those gaps that I've created, this gap and this gap are both 100 thousandths, and then this gap right here would have to be half that, about 50 thousandths. So that looks approximately correct. So let me move my 400 thousandths up right above that and squeeze it in there. Let's see if I can get it right there. And my next decimal is 7 thousandths. And hopefully it's pretty clear that that is a very small number. There's nothing in the tenths, nothing in the hundredths, so that is way less than even 1/4. Matter of fact, it's very, very close to 0. If I were to place a couple little markers on here, I could say that this might be approximately 200 thousandths. So then this would be approximately 100 thousandths. This would be about 50 thousandths, about 25, and then 7 is going to be way less than that, even less than half of 25. So if I were to estimate, let's say it's right about there, 7 thousandths. So let me move that up there. My next number is 63 hundredths, and I'm going to place a 0 in the thousandths place to make this a little bit easier to compare. And first thing I'm going to do is try to compare it to a half. So I have a 6 in the tenths. A half has 5 in the tenths, so it's definitely greater than a half. But it is less than 3/4 because this has a 7 in the tenths and this is a 6 in the tenths. So now I'm going to try to estimate. And I think right about there would be about where 700 thousandths would be, which would make this be about 600 thousandths. 630 is a little bit less than halfway between 600 and 700, so I'm going to say right about here is 630 thousandths, and I'll move that right up there next to it. My last number is 5 hundredths. Again, I'm going to place a 0 in the thousandths place to make it easier for me to compare to all my other numbers that are up there on the number line. And again, this is a very small number because I have nothing in the tenths, so that tells me it's way less than 1/4. Remember that on here, this was 200 thousandths, this was 100 thousandths, and this is 50. The number that I'm trying to place is 51 thousandths. So if this is 100 thousandths, half of that right there would be 50 thousandths. So right here is 50 thousandths, and I'm going to have to place that on the bottom so that I have room. So there's my 50 thousandths right there. So here's another example. This time I've placed a few more decimals, and this time my decimals are slightly greater. So again, with an open number line like this, I must decide first where is my lower limit and where is my upper limit on the number line. All of these decimals are greater than 0, so I'm going to place a 0 on the left-hand side. And all of these decimals are less than 2, so I'm going to place a 2 over here on the right. So halfway across my number line this time would be 1 because half of 2 is 1 whole. So I'm going to start out with that. Then I'm going to do half of 1 whole. Half of 1 whole is a half, which is 5/10. And between 1 whole and 2 wholes would be 1 1/2, as a decimal would be 1 5/10. And just as I did in the last example, I'm going to extend the place values of my benchmark decimals to make it easier for me to compare. And I'm even going to do that on the 1 whole here. I could do that on the 0 and the 2 as well, just to show you that they also will go all the way to the thousandths place. And when I begin comparing the 8/10, I'm going to extend it as well. And now I'm ready to start comparing decimals. So the first thing I'm going to do is realize that this is less than a whole because there is a 0 in the ones place. So I know it's somewhere in this range right here. The 8 tells me that it is greater than a half because a half has a 5 in the tenths place. This has an 8. So now I know it's somewhere in this range right here. So now I'm going to have to do a little bit further estimation to place some more benchmark decimals in this range to help me know exactly where 8/10 would go. So halfway between 500 thousandths and 1,000 thousandths would be right about there. And that would be 750 thousandths. So my 8/10 has an 8 in the tenths place. 750 thousandths has a 7 in the tenths place. So I've narrowed down my range again. 800 thousandths is somewhere right in here. Now I'll do a little bit more estimation. I'm going to say if that's 750, let's say right about there would be 800, so that would make this right about 900 thousandths. So I've found where 8/10 is. It's right about here, and I can now move my decimal into its correct position. My next number is 1 24 thousandths, which is greater than 1 whole, so it's definitely in this range somewhere. Its next digit is a 0 in the tenths place, and a half has a 5 in the tenths place. So it's somewhere in this range. And now I'm going to have to do a little bit more estimation to figure out its exact spot. So halfway between 1 whole and 1.5 would be right about, well, let's say right about there. And if 1 whole is 1,000 thousandths and 1.5 is 1,500 thousandths, this would be 1 and 250 thousandths. So if that's 1 and 250 thousandths, let's say right about here is 1 and 200 thousandths. So this would be 1 and 100 thousandths. And I can't get too much smaller than that without really not being able to see things. Even when I try to label this 1 and 100 thousandths, it's really hard for you to see there. So I'm going to go back and look at my number here. And this is 1 and 24 thousandths. So that's not even halfway to between 1 whole and 1 and 100 thousandths. So there's 1 and 50 thousandths. It's about halfway between there. So right approximately about there. So I'm going to go ahead and place that decimal right on the number line, right about there or so. Move that to its correct position. And now look at my next number, 1 and 7/10. I'm going to go ahead and place zeros in the hundredths and the thousandths so I can compare it more easily. This again is greater than 1 whole, and the 7 is greater than the 5 here, and 1 and 1/2, so this is greater than 1 and 1/2. So we're down to this range right here. I again need to now place some more benchmark decimals to help me estimate exactly where it will go. So halfway between 1.5 and 2 wholes is right about there. And if 1.5 is 1 and 500 thousandths and 2 wholes is 2,000 thousandths, this would be 1 and 750 thousandths. 1 and 7/10 is 1 and 700 thousandths, which looks like it's going to be just slightly less than 1 and 750 thousandths. I'm going to place a few more benchmark decimals to help me get it exact. But if 1 and 750 is right here, 1 and 700 is probably right about there. So that would make this 1 and 600 thousandths. So I know where 1 and 750 is, right about there. I can move my decimal now to its correct position. My next decimal is 0 and 14 thousandths, less than 1 whole. It's also less than 1/2. Matter of fact, this is very close to 0 because we only have 14 thousandths. So I'm going to very quickly place some more benchmark decimals on the number line. Halfway between 0 and 500 thousandths, right about there, would be 250 thousandths. And if that's 250, right about here would be 200, which would make this 100 thousandths. And 14 thousandths is not even halfway from 0 to 100 thousandths. There's halfway. That would be 50 thousandths. There's right about 25 thousandths. It's 14 thousandths is just right about there. It's a very small number, and on this number line, without zooming in, it's hard to even see exactly where it belongs, but somewhere right in there. So I'll move it to its position. My next decimal is 1 and 23 hundredths. I'm going to place a 0 in the thousandths place. And now I can compare. It is greater than 1 whole, but it is less than 1 and 1/2 because 1 and 1/2 has a 5 in the tenths place. Now, because I've already done a whole bunch of work on this number line, I can compare it to some of my other benchmark decimals. This would be 1 and 1/4, and this is just slightly less than that. This is 230 thousandths. This is 250 thousandths. And if you remember, this was 1 and 200 thousandths. So 230 will be somewhere right about there. So I'll place that line on the number line right about there and move the decimal to its position. My next number is 93 hundredths. I'm going to place a 0 in the thousandths place. And this is less than 1 whole, but it's fairly close to 1 whole because we have 9/10. So it looks like it's 930 thousandths, which is more than 900 thousandths. So we're in this range right in here. And halfway, right about there, between 900 and 1,000, halfway would be 950. We're not quite there. We're slightly less, so maybe right about there. And my number line's getting kind of full right now, so it's going to be hard for me to move this into its correct spot. I'm going to put it on the bottom of the number line, right about there. And my last number is 1 and 607 thousandths. We're greater than a whole. We're also greater than 1 and 1/2. 1 1/2 has a 5 in the tenths. So we've already got 1 and 600 thousandths on the number line right here. This is 1 and 607, which is just very slightly greater than 1 and 600 thousandths. So probably as close as we can possibly get to this is where it belongs. So let me place its line on there as best as I can, right about there. I'm going to have to place this underneath the decimal or the number line again. So now I have all of my decimals approximately where they belong on the number line.